So basically, three layers of critique, and I'll try to be as concise as I can. The general question that I would raise is about the ways in which this approach treats spatial differentiation of human populations as natural. In other words, the same way that plant species differentiate across a habitat, so too do human beings, and so the clusters of human beings, you know, by ethnicity or by race, is just understood to be like, well, that's just what human beings do. And that black boxes or renders invisible questions about why do these groupings form? How are those groupings, these clusters, connected to power, inequality, exclusion, and violence? Those kinds of questions, which I think are fundamental, are just, they're rendered invisible because it's just taken for granted that the Germans are going to cluster, or that the Jews are going to cluster, or that African Americans are going to cluster. Is it a question of choice? There might be some, you know, cultural, in some ethnic enclaves, there might be linguistic and cultural or religious affinities that lead maybe some people to want to be in proximity. But in the case of African Americans in particular, we're going to talk momentarily about institutionalized racial apartheid and racial violence that severely limit the ability of particular population groups, in this case, Black people in the United States, to live where they want to live. So the forces of change, aggregation, expansion, succession, are treated in ahistorical terms as general universal laws of social life. So questions about capitalism, the division of labor, the way that capitalism generates transformations, the creative destruction of urban space, the way that political institutions mediate urban spatial differentiation, law, and policy, they're rendered to the background. They may not be entirely invisible, but they're considered basically mediating factors at best, because the actual patterns themselves are understood to be universal. And we have to ask, and many have actually argued, that it's kind of a social, not kind of, but that it is a social Darwinist approach, that it's treating competition between human beings, in other words, within the human species, as being as natural as competition, you know, in the evolutionary process for survival. So applying that kind of notion of a Darwinian competition to intrahuman relations, and that can of course naturalize inequality, and it can lead, I'm not saying Burgess and Park believe this, but it can lead to the idea that, like, let's say the wealthy or advantaged in society, as it were, earned it because they survived, they won out in the competition, and anyone who might be disadvantaged or marginalized or poor is somehow weaker. So it can lead, if one believes that, and there's people obviously to this day who do believe that, and powerful people and powerful institutions who believe that, that can lead to a kind of further ossification of existing forms of inequality and injustice. So there's some very dangerous, potentially dangerous, very reactionary implications of this, whether they were intended by the Chicago School or not. The embrace of that kind of Darwinian and plant ecological model to study intrahuman inequality may actually render invisible precisely the kinds of dynamics that we need to look at. So let me now just illustrate that with reference to, there are a lot of examples one could give, but let me illustrate it with reference to the black belt. So here's how they describe the black belt. They say wedging out from here, this is when they're sort of narrating the differentiation of the city within Chicago. And they say wedging out from here is the black belt with its free and disorderly life. So already that formulation is absolutely exoticizing and pathologizing of the African-American population of the black belt, that it's free and disorderly. Well, we can ask about the positionality of Burgess and Park and their colleagues in representing the social worlds of the African-American community in Chicago and elsewhere as free and disorderly, and unpack what that means relative to the other zones that they thought were orderly and stable, like completely projecting certain assumptions about, you know, how social life should be organized onto that particular neighborhood. And then they refer to it furthermore, very pejoratively, as a zone of deterioration. Again, we can unpack what are they referring to there, what are the sources of that deterioration. But let's now look at their actual map. So you'll notice that here's the black belt. That's it's very different in the graphic design of the map, in the visual design of the map, to to any other part of the map. You can see the black belt is this band. It's this long rectangular band in South Chicago, and none of the other neighborhoods, not Deutschland, not Little Sicily, has any kind of coloration. It's just simply the word. So there's something going on here. And here's also from Chicago School, the census tract of Chicago a couple years after Burgess wrote this essay. And you can see the black belt shows up here as a zone of, this is the percentage population, as it was then referred to, Negro, the African-American or black population. Almost 90 to 99% in this black belt area is black. So, so there's something going on here of just a fairly intense segregation. So I want to raise two questions about the black belt. Problem one is that effectively the human ecology approach is naturalizing what we really must describe as urban apartheid, the institutionalized and violent enclosure of the ghetto through racist policy and state repression. So African Americans at this particular time were basically, through law and through state violence and through everyday violence, confined and contained to the black belt. Whereas the patterns and processes that may have led the Sicilians to locate in Little Sicily, or the German immigrants to locate in Deutschland, were very, very different. But their theory doesn't make any, doesn't offer any account of that particular difference. So here's Little Sicily. Here's Chinatown. That's another important ethnic, we might call it an ethnic enclave, which isn't to say that Chinese or other ethnic populations are not also subjected to different forms of discrimination and even racialized violence at this particular moment in the US. But it's just to say that there's a particular form and intensity of racial violence and explicit segregation that is inflicted upon the African American population in many US cities, in pretty much all US cities during this time. So you can see the ghetto, Deutschland, etc., completely different from the black belt. And basically it's treated as if it were analogous to other ethnic neighborhoods, the Chinese, the German, the Jewish, and the Polish. But this is a really problematic analogy also empirically. The level of segregation and racial enclosure of African Americans in the black belt was completely unique to that population. As I showed a moment ago from the census diagram, something like 90%, whereas the equivalent, I wasn't able to find the data for this lecture, but Thomas Philpott has a book where he looked at this in detail. The equivalent level of concentration, let's say, of Germans or Chinese within the equivalent Deutschland or Chinatown neighborhoods, it's like below 50%. And meanwhile, there might be German descendants, German heritage, or Chinese in other neighborhoods of Chicago, rather than all being concentrated in Deutschland or Chinatown. But in the black belt, it's not only 90% or something like that of African Americans, but there are very few African Americans who even have the option to live anyplace else because of racial segregation, institutionalized at this moment and then intensifying in the subsequent decades. So only a small percentage of black people were able to reside outside the black belt. And to the degree that they did that, they were often subjected to racist violence, both institutionally, legally, and extra-legally. So here's the Philpott book, The Slum and the Ghetto. I don't have access to my books at the moment, but otherwise I would have looked up the data, but it's pretty striking. He's got all the data in there that basically shows that the level of segregation, the segregation index for other populations and all the other neighborhoods that show up in the dartboard model of Burgess, much, much lower. Whereas for African Americans, it's a completely different situation, but they don't have any analytic framework or concepts through which to try to decipher why that would occur. The sort of racist character of the urban fabric is described, but not analyzed. It's simply reduced to the same laws that govern plant ecology. So there's massive institutionalized and extra-legal violence against black people during this period, earlier and subsequently, to maintain racial apartheid in US cities, including in Chicago. So Philpott describes it as the residential confinement of African Americans. And he gives lots of examples in the scholarly literature. There's many other examples. The relocation of vice, prostitution, gambling, etc., into the black belt, racialized zoning laws. There's a lot of legal contestation around zoning at this time, but even when certain racist zoning laws are rendered unconstitutional, strategies are devised to still basically do racial zoning. White neighborhood clubs and property owners associations, including right here in Hyde Park, the Hyde Park Improvement and Protective Club, and the Hyde Park Kenwood Association, notorious for basically trying to exclude African Americans from the neighborhood. So it's not so distant from the University of Chicago, because University of Chicago is obviously in the same neighborhood. So the university's own relationship to this is pretty direct, and the fact that Park and Burgess working in this neighborhood and then effectively naturalizing the level of racial segregation and racist violence against Black people is problematic, to say the least.